Hi, I'm Nick. I was diagnosed with Ewing sarcoma in 2010 with a primary in my pelvis with spread to my lungs, spine, skull and leg. I then underwent 6 rounds of chemotherapy, followed by a stem cell transplant and 6 weeks of radiotherapy, which lasted about 9 months. And then after that I was into the recovery period. I'd say it took me maybe 2-3 years after that to get back to where I was, to get back to full health. But I'm now doing pretty well. I did the marathon for bone cancer research just this year, and I've got a few more things planned for later on. The first symptoms I experienced, which suggested something might be wrong, was knee pain in my right knee. I went to the doctors in around March time, so around 6 months before I was fully diagnosed. I went back a number of times. They did an x-ray of the knee, which was very close to picking up the tumour that was in my pelvis, but it was just slightly too low. And then in the August, I went to my GP and I got the knee pain again, and he referred me for physio. And as I was getting up to leave, I said there's a bit of a weird lump on the lower of my back. Literally, as I was walking out the door, I mentioned it to him, and he stopped me and he had a look at it and he said, "That's a bit unusual, but not something that we're particularly worried about. We'll get you booked in for an ultrasound. There's going to be a bit of a waiting list for that, but we'll try and get something sorted." Luckily enough, I managed to get a cancellation for an ultrasound the next week due to a receptionist that literally saved my life, and obviously my mum pushing a bit for this, and that revealed that it was something a bit more aggressive. And this was followed by an X-ray of my pelvis and then a CT of my chest, which shows that I'd had a malignant growth on my right iliac bone and my pelvis, and I had spread to my lungs as well. This was then followed by a bone scan the next day, and further scans which showed that it had progressed to other areas of my body. And at that point, obviously, I was told that I had cancer. Not sure what type it was at that point. I was then taken down to the Royal Orthopaedic Hospital in Birmingham, where they took a sample of the tumour and told me that I had something called Ewing sarcoma. From my side, I'd never heard of bone cancer before. My initial thought when they said bone cancer, I was like, isn't that leukemia? And it was only when they explained to me that there's a difference between those two things, and that primary bone cancer is a thing, that I realised that it was something that young people got, and that it was actually something that was extremely rare and extremely aggressive in my case. The treatments varied in terms of what they were. So the first stage they always start off with is systematic treatment. It started off with chemotherapy. I had VIDE chemotherapy, which is a combination of 4 different drugs, and I was given 6 cycles of this. I'd have roughly 1 cycle every 3 to 4 weeks. The best bit about chemotherapy is that they wait until you're better again before giving you the next round. So it's when you're having your chemotherapy that you're at your fittest, at your healthiest. That would consist of 4 days in hospital. I wouldn't be able to leave hospital for those 4 days. Chemotherapy itself took quite a toll. So I lost my hair, I became very, very ill. I couldn't eat, I couldn't drink. I was extremely tired. I had to go under a number of different treatments, like blood transfusions for platelets, to stop myself feeling so tired. It was getting to the point where I'd almost pass out, I'd fall asleep just as and when I was just so tired. But blood transfusions has saved me a few times, and I had that from September through till the January. In January I then had some more scans which potentially suggested that the cancer had started to come back. Luckily enough, this wasn't true. It was an error on one of the scans. I then had a stem cell transplant where I was in hospital for 5 weeks, and I was given a huge dose of chemotherapy which completely ruined my immune system, completely got rid of it. I was kept in isolation, I was fed through a tube, and off the back of that they gave me my stem cells back, and from that my immune system started to grow back, and hopefully the idea was that it would do me a lot of damage, but it would kill the cancer as well. Following that, I then had a few months where I was at home, but I was generally kept almost in isolation. It was a long recovery period, just in terms of I was very tired. I couldn't really do much at the moment, and it was just getting back to eating normally and starting to make progress in just what, in hindsight, were very basic things in terms of being able to live something resembling a normal life. And once I'd got back to that stage, they then stuck me with 6 weeks of radiotherapy, which was to the primary site on my pelvis. So I travelled about an hour and a half each way, every day for 6 weeks for the radiotherapy. And after that, I then started on the follow-up process where I'd have scans every so often just to monitor how the progress was going, to monitor how I was doing. And that continued for 5 years. And at the end of those 5 years, I was told that I was a Ewing sarcoma survivor. My tumour on my pelvis was inoperable. All the other parts of my body were in locations where, because it was so widespread, it wouldn't be feasible to take parts of it out. So, example, the bits in my lungs were quite widespread. The bits on my leg were all over my thigh bone. Bits on my pelvis, not only with the primary on the right hand side, I think there was a tumour about the size of a golf ball on the left hand side, and the bits on the skull were lots of small dots about the size of a penny each. So it wasn't really feasible to tackle those with any surgery. Being told you have cancer is obviously quite shocking. Being told that 16 is even worse. Seeing the effect it has on family and friends, and then being told that what you have is so rare that you're being put into a clinical trial for new drugs, that what you're being doing is a trial of treatments that may or may not work. Being told by doctors that it's spread, and that obviously the first thing they say to do is not to go and look it up online, which usually is the first thing you do for most things nowadays, which I went and did anyway, and then seeing what the information was out there and realising potentially how serious this was, and it's sort of something that makes you question your own mortality at an age where not many people are thinking about that. It makes you think quite in depth about how important it is to be healthy. It makes you realise how lucky you are to be healthy, like especially coming out the other side of it. It makes you realise how difficult life can be for people with these long-term health conditions. It makes you realise the importance of research. I think for me, the idea that some of the treatments that I were being given were as tough as you could get in terms of treatment made me realise that this is something quite serious. I suppose it's only something that after as you look back on it, as you kind of moved away from the situation, you realise how serious it was, and how life-threatening it was. And at the time, you just get on with it. You don't really have. I was asked the question if I wanted to have treatment. It's one of them things where when they ask you, of course I'd like to have treatment. I'm not good. Why would I give up so soon? And it's only with hindsight you can realise that the reason they were asking is because that's the sort of situation it was. It was a situation where some people choose to not have treatment just because it was very widespread. It wasn't guaranteed that the treatment would work at all. So it's only when you kind of think about it in those terms and you think about that aspect of it that you realise how serious it was, and that I suppose it does make you think quite deeply, just about the importance of it. And just taking it forward, it makes you appreciate things a bit more. Makes you appreciate being healthy now. I'm 3 years since being given the all clear, so 3 years around now actually. My follow-up at the moment consists of just 1 day a year where I'll go in and they'll do a chest x-ray, they'll take some blood, they'll do some heart checks, they'll check my kidneys and just generally give me the old once-over, a little MOT as such. But that's all it is at the moment. I'd say from my side I've become a lot more aware and a lot more health conscious. I'm a lot more focused on if there is something there, I'll go to the doctor straight away. If there's a bump or a bruise or a pain, I'll keep an eye on it and just be that bit more aware. So I think there's there's definitely a two-pronged attitude towards follow-up, in that I do it myself and I'm more aware of my body, but I also have the annual checkup. My advice for any individual or family facing the journey through any type of bone cancer would be: you're going to need to rely on each other. You're going to need to have trust in the doctors and nurses that are around you. I would say don't be afraid to ask questions. So I think a lot of my agency in my journey as such is that I've asked doctors questions that maybe I've been nervous to ask them. Maybe my parents have wanted to know, but they've not quite felt brave enough to ask. I think so it's important to ask those questions. I think obviously outside of your family, your friends are really important, just as having people to fall back on. Don't be afraid to fall back on people and rely on them. They will be there for you. If there's one silver lining to the dark cloud that is bone cancer, it's that you really realise that friends are there for you, and that you do have a support network, and that people do look out for you, and that people genuinely do care. With regards to just general treatment, there's no way of getting around it. It's going to be very, very tough. You're going to learn a lot about yourself. You're going to learn a lot about how far you can push yourself, just in terms of what you can cope with. I think at the end of the day, you realise that if you have to go through tough times to get through to the good bit at the end. It's not all going to be good news. Cling on to any bits of good news, really. There's always going to be a glimmer of hope. In my case, it was that my cancer hadn't spread to my bone marrow, which was just the first piece of good news that we got. So you've got cancer, it's spread to the lungs, it's spread to other bones in your body. We can't operate on it, and then it was just that really one small piece of good news kind of made you realise that it wasn't all negative. It was just something to cling on to. I'd say the other thing that's quite important is do speak to the other families around you. So you're going to be on a ward where, in my case, lots of other young people that had either bone cancer or other types of cancer. And I think learning to speak to them, it gives you someone that's going through the same process. I know the same happens for parents, and my parents spoke to other parents that could really sympathise and understand what they were going through. Particularly in cases where it would be hard to fully explain to people that hadn't experienced cancer in the same way. I think the Bone Cancer Research Trust is extremely important for the work it does. I think the lack of funding given towards research into bone cancer is absolutely shocking. I understand that it's not as widespread as other cancers, it's not as common. But I think the fact that the treatment at the moment is, in some cases, very dated. Some of the drugs that I was given haven't changed since the 1980s. The fact that in my case their first option was to go in with the most brutal treatment possible is suggestive that this funding is very important. I also think my process of diagnosis was quite important, in the fact I was going to my GP for 6 months, and it wasn't his fault. It was a fault of the system that he wasn't aware of this. His words to me was that he'd come across it once when he was at medical school and hadn't heard of it since. So I think the work Bone Cancer Research Trust is doing on improving that is very important. I think there's still work to be done, but they're doing a fantastic job so far. I think outside of that, also because in my case, and as with all primary bone cancers, it's such a rare disease, to be able to speak to researchers, speak to other families and other patients and other survivors is very important. For me personally, I spent a lot of time trying to look for someone that had survived metastatic Ewing sarcoma. Once again, in almost like that search to hope to cling on to. But I could never really find anyone. It was only like when I came into contact with the Bone Cancer Research Trust that I started to meet other people that had survived different types of bone cancers, and started to give me a bit of an experience about, or a bit of understanding about what life after treatment can look like. And I think also for me, it did give me something to direct a lot of energy towards. So obviously, I've come through treatment. I've come through the 5-year survival period, and I feel like I still feel like I need to do work on this, and I still feel like I've got something to give. I've got a wealth of experience, and I want to do some fundraising for it. I want to get some raise money, raise awareness, and I think Bone Cancer Research Trust is particularly good at doing that and making sure that the money itself and the awareness itself is devoted to the right people, and it's going to the right places, and it's done in the best way possible.